So this is a video about the problems with taking advice online, but I'm actually going to start with why you should take advice online and what's actually good about it. And then we'll work backwards from that. So why is it good to take advice online? Well, if you hear the right information, the right advice, the right perspective, at the right time, when you're in the right state of mind, and it's the right thing for you in that moment, it can be life-changing. It can completely change the trajectory of your life. It could open something up, change the way you see yourself, annihilate a bad habit. It could be like, it could seriously be life-changing, right? Advice can be life-changing for a person. So we're starting with that. The right information can be life-changing. Just think about that for a minute. So if that's true, and maybe you've had this experience too, where you've just heard something or seen something and it's totally shifted your perspective for the better, right? I think many people can relate to at least one experience like that in their lives. So bear that in mind. Advice can be good. So the question then is how to have that. Because I think we've all had experiences with advice online, or advice anywhere from anyone, from your friend or family member even. We've all had experiences where the advice has actually made things worse. Like either it's been totally inappropriate advice, or it's really coming from the person like trying to reassure us or trying to fix us. Or if it's on, if it's online, it could be, there may be a kernel of truth to the advice, but it's mostly mixed in with bullshit and coming from perverse incentives and all that. So advice can be very bad, and it can lead to also making ourselves really wrong, judging ourselves, criticizing ourselves, feeling like there's something wrong with us, feeling like this other person here has it all figured out and I don't, comparing ourselves to others, right? So advice can be really amazing, and it can also be horrific, right? Horrible and horrific if it's received in the wrong context, from the wrong state of mind. If it's the wrong advice, right, it can be really bad. Have that as your starting frame, okay? Advice can be really good and really bad. So there's a lot to play for here. There's a lot to play for. It's not as simple as just stop watching stuff online, because you're potentially depriving yourself of that insight moment that's going to change your life, right? But at the same time, you could, like advice online can also lead to you just suffering a lot and not really being good advice at all. So then what do we do about this? This seems frustrating. What do we do? So fundamentally, and you might have picked it up from what I said there, it's as much about the signal and the advice that's communicated. So we could talk about that, like what is being communicated actually, and what's the signal in that, like what's actually juicy and good about that. And the place that we are in when we receive that advice, where we are in life, the mental state we're in, what we're thinking about, and so on, right? So it's also about where we are when we receive that advice. That's just as important as the advice itself, right? So the same piece of advice you hear now, you hear in 10 years, might reach you very differently, might land very differently with you, right? So, okay, with all that said, what are some of the challenges? So let's focus on the first thing first, which is people giving you advice, and is it good advice? How do you discern the signal? And what gets in the way of the good bit of the advice, right? What, in my opinion, what gets in the way of the good bit? Well, think about why someone would want to give you advice. There could be very good reasons for someone giving you advice, and there can be not so good reasons. So a good reason would be the person has struggled with something in life. They have overcome some challenge, they have developed in some way, they've had a struggle or a challenge or a pain point in life, and they've found a way through it. And they've learned in the process, and they've changed who they are in the process. And what this person wants to do now, this great person wants to now share their journey with you and help you so that you do not have to struggle like that and suffer like that. And so you can be basically free of that, which is an amazing place to come from when giving advice, right? It's coming from a place of compassion. You want the person to be happy. You want the person to be free of the struggles of life that they're in and the suffering and so on, right? That's awesome. But that's not all. It's not the only place advice can come from. Advice can also come from trying to fix someone. So if you see someone in pain and you give them advice, it might be because you just don't want to see them in pain. Like it's uncomfortable for you to see this person suffering. So, let's give them advice to try and fix them. Or it could be that you're trying to give, the person giving you advice actually wants to get something from you. So for example, money, status, influence, fame, success, money, probably, sex, power, etc. Right? Like someone wants to get something from you, and to get something from you as part of that, they want to give you advice, maybe sound like an authority, maybe convince you of something, and so that's where they're coming from, and so the advice is coming from that. And the funny thing about that is there may still be good bits of that advice and signal in the advice, but it's likely mixed in with a lot of bad stuff that actually is detrimental to you and is selling their agenda, right? Their perverse incentives, their ulterior motives, and not actually meeting you where you are and serving you, right? As in the first example. So, and this kind of gets worse when we talk about this in the context of online advice and say, watching YouTube videos or consuming infotainment and so on, right? Because online advice is talking to a large audience. These creators are broadcasting their message to many people, which in itself is a problem because instead of being able to sit down one-to-one with someone and help someone to just co-discover or co-create with someone exactly what advice would help them, exactly what they need, you have to try to guess and broadcast to like this large amorphous audience that you may or may not understand well. And probably the message is going to be diluted and riddled with like clickbaity stuff or entertainment to keep audience captured and entertained whilst you deliver the advice. And it's sort of, it's never going to land. It's very unlikely to land as well as if you were just one-to-one with the person. So part of what I do is I'm a teacher, right? I teach software engineers how to program, basically, and I'm also a coach, a transformational coach. So in both of those situations, working one-to-one with someone, so in coaching, let's take coaching first. In coaching, when I trained as a coach, one of the things that's very important is that you don't give advice at all. And the reason you don't give advice is because it's usually very unhelpful. What you do instead is you ask questions and you basically facilitate the client, the person you're coaching, to see their own kind of assumptions, blind spots, worldview, things they hadn't considered, and that unsticks them, right? Because you probably already know the thing you want to do or should do, or think you should do. But there's probably an inner conflict, and the advice does not resolve the inner conflict, but actually looking deep at your own experience can resolve the inner conflict. So that's what coaching is about. It's more about seeing your own assumptions, right? Having someone be a space where you can explore your own experience more deeply and see your assumptions, right? And then maybe accountability and stuff comes in later, but it's more about seeing and becoming aware of what you're doing and how you're being and so on, right? And that really tends to meet people more than some kind of cookie cutter advice would. It tends to meet people. Now, in the example of teaching, it's well known that the most effective form of teaching is one-to-one tutoring. It's by far the most effective. A lot of research has been done on this. It trumps classroom teaching, group teaching, right? One-to-one teaching is much more effective. Why? Well, because you can actually develop a relationship with the person. So probably a few reasons, but you can develop a relationship with the student. You can actually look at the student's mind, have the student share their context, right? Their whole worldview, where they're coming from, and their relationship and their personal struggles with the topic you're teaching. And you can meet them there directly, right? Rather than trying to throw out some advice that is sort of trying to meet everyone but doesn't really meet anyone, kind of thing, right? So we've just covered a lot of stuff there, but broadly, the problem is advice going out to a lot of people has to be in some way simplified, and even if it's not, it's probably not going to meet everyone exactly where they are, just because it's talking to an audience, right? It's talking to a larger audience, and the bigger the audience gets, the bigger this problem gets. So we've covered other things too, like the assumptions, right, that someone might hold when they're making content or videos or advice. So we mentioned perverse incentives, but there can also be assumptions that the person has just in their worldview. There's such a thing called survivorship bias, where people who have started successful companies, right? I think it's 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 startups succeed. It's maybe 1 in 10. I think it's going to depend on demographics and so on. But if you're starting a company and if you have a lot of people starting companies, some of those companies will be successful. And those are the companies that you will hear about. And the people that started those successful companies, it's their advice you're likely to be exposed to. You're not going to be exposed to all of the failures, all of the failed companies, failed startups. The 9 out of 10 that did not succeed, you probably never hear about, and you don't get their perspective. You don't get to learn from them. You don't get to see what didn't work. So survivorship bias is a thing. Most people who are successful got there likely through a combination of a lot of things. There's going to be a combination of again, their advice can have real signal, real truth in it, but there's also a lot of really hyper contextual stuff, as well as luck and what their background was and why it meant that they could have a successful company in the way they did and the information they had and so on. That's hyper specific and contextual and being in the right place at the right time, right? So I don't want to downplay anyone who's achieved things in life, but really I want to emphasize a lesson in humility for us, in that if someone is giving advice, it might not be relevant, it might not be applicable. They might infer they know more than they do about what it means to be successful because of one particular way they got successful that doesn't apply to 99% of people, right? So survivorship bias is a thing. Assumptions too, more generally. This is the general point about survivorship bias, but about someone's worldview and how they give advice. People don't know their assumptions. People don't know what beliefs and views they're coming from, usually. That stuff is hidden from them. And so when someone gives you advice, they give it with all those assumptions built in. And those could be the fact that their advice only works, like the survivorship bias, the fact that the advice only works because of all these other experiences they had, which they're also not talking about, or maybe don't even see, that they're not communicating when giving the advice, right? So someone can have a bunch of assumptions and a worldview in which this advice makes sense and where they maybe even really believe it makes sense, but it's missing very important context and it's incomplete. And so ultimately it might not land with you or might not help you. Another point about advice, this is about online advice, is that anyone can be exposed to it, and people are all on very different paths in life. People have very different backgrounds, very different experiences. And advice, as we said, the same piece of advice will land differently now than it might land in 10 years' time. So this also has to be considered. So I hope I've painted a picture here of okay, there are a lot of problems with receiving advice online. There's just a lot going on, and it can be hard to discern the signal from the noise. So how do we discern the signal from the noise then? And now we're getting into advice. So the same stuff that I've just been talking about applies. So I want you to take what I've just said And we're going to use that as an exercise to see if it resonates with you. So what do I even mean by resonates with you? Well, the advice, what I just said, probably impacted you in different ways. There were certain parts of it that really landed and felt important. And there were certain parts of it that seemed irrelevant. Probably. Maybe it all seemed relevant, but doubtful, because I'm victim to the same dynamics that I just spoke about, right? So which parts do you listen to? Well, my advice would be start with the stuff that resonates for you. What stuff resonated for you and why? And what does that tell you about yourself? So actually using the stuff I said as a basis for self-inquiry and increasing self-awareness. Remember, when I gave the example of coaching, a lot of the things that keep us stuck in life, or we often already know the right thing to do, in quotes, right thing to do, but we get stuck. There's an internal conflict. So what is the internal conflict? And if you take what I say and something opens up for you, and you see something about yourself that you didn't see before, and the way you've been, maybe you had assumptions about online advice or your relationship to advice, if something starts to shift, my advice would be to notice what that is and what it opens up for you. Are there new possibilities available to you now? How are you relating to things differently? So use it as a pointer to your own internal experience and what you personally feel is true. I think in general, we want to move in a direction where it's less about taking advice from the outside, or at the very least, it's more boundaried. So when we take advice from the outside, we take in the signal and we discern what's not helpful, and we have the confidence in that process to say no to the things that don't serve us and just switch that off, right? So boundaries and becoming more boundaried around advice feels really important. But I think even more so, we want to move in a direction where we're more and more connecting with our personal sovereignty and agency in life. So I'm going to put to you that there's an authentic, alive impulse within you, a direction your whole being as a kind of whole organism wants to move in life. Things that connect, that you resonate with, things that don't, things that you're called to do and things you're not called to do. And like this impulse within you wants to grow and expand, right? You want to become more yourself, basically. You want to become more authentic, more connected to yourself and others, and discover yourself in life, right? This is what I would put to you. So how does one connect to that authentic impulse? How does this relate to advice? Well, this authentic impulse is very different from all the shoulds and conditioning we got as kids. So as kids, at school, we got all of this conditioning and all of this stuff around how we should be and what is acceptable. Excuse me. What stuff is acceptable for us to bring of ourselves. So there's conditioning. And in some ways, we learned to suppress our authentic life energy, let's say, life force, authentic inner self, or authentic inner expression of ourselves. And that if we become more connected to that, not only can it becomes easier to see the signal from noise, because we can start to see them when stuff comes from shoulds and from conditioning, and when it comes from like genuine wanting to serve and contribute, right? We can discern that more carefully, which is what we said at the very beginning. If we can discern the advice and discern what's valuable about it in such a way that it gives us insight about our life and about our experience and opens things up, then the advice can change our life. But it's not the advice that's changed our life. It's what that advice connected with in us, this authentic drive towards life and aliveness and greater wholeness and so on. It connected with that and possibility, the possibility of ourselves and our lives. It connected with that thing. And so because of that, it opened something up for us. It shifted something, right? it allowed our whole organism to align and reorient in a way that is, more fulfilling and more deeply fulfilling for us and more connected to who we really are. So that's when it's good advice, and that's when the advice lands. And hopefully I've convinced you that good advice now is not a matter of the advice you receive. It's a complex process of both what you receive and how you interpret, receive, resonate with that advice and what it opens up for you. And so that would be my advice, which you should take with a pinch of salt. And I would say one more thing is that experiment with what I just said. So does that resonate with you? If you try that on for yourself with what I've said, does it open something up for you? Where has it left you? And that, I think, is a good pointer for how to receive advice. So hopefully you've enjoyed. I know that's a lot, feels like a lot of information, a lot of perspective there, but I will be digesting it, and hopefully it was of use to you. And hope to see you on the next one. Take care.